What good is that? Huh? How can I use this text to prove that my denomination or my sexuality is correct and other people's sexuality is evil? That's an egocentric interpretation of the Scriptures. And that's the way it's been used by the calculating mind instead of the contemplative mind, which doesn't try to damn people or raise other people to heaven. It just lets the terrifying, wonderful moment be what it is, and primarily ask something of me, not always using it to convert the nations. This, so I can convert the nations, always has the assumption that I'm already converted, which might be a false assumption, and often has been. Secondly, a contemplative psychology, a contemplative set of lenses and eyes. It does not need to prove or validate any church protocols. It's just willing to hear from a beginner's mind, yet also learn from the tradition. I don't want to make this individualistic. It's saying, how has the whole history of interpretation seen this? Because I might be very idiosyncratic and way off beam. So I don't want to separate us from the tradition at all. And the contemplative mind has the humility to do just that. To say all of our ancestors were not totally stupid, right? They had the Holy Spirit too. They were listening to God too. They were praying too. A contemplative mind has the humility to receive both and thinking, and not all or nothing thinking. Now we call this non-dual thinking. It leads to what we also call the third way. Neither fight things nor flee from things, neither fight nor flight, but standing in between, the third way, where I can hold what I do know together with what I don't know, and let that wonderful mix lead me to wisdom, instead of this quick knowledge that we've sought up to now, which largely just creates opinionated people, not wise people. Quick opinions, as we just saw in the political debate of the last year. Quick, hard, and fast opinions that close down the dialogue, close down the spiritual seeking, close down the respect for the other. I don't need to respect you. I don't need to listen to you because I've got my answers already. We used to have a line, and forgive my Latin, I'm not trying to impress you because, as I said, I was never very good in Latin. But this was the line in early scholastic philosophy. Quid recipitur ad modum recipientis. Terrible, isn't it? What it means is whatever is received according to the manner of the receiver. Got it? Whatever is received, both John Duns Scotus, who died 800 years ago today, and Thomas Aquinas both said the same thing. Whatever is received according to the manner of the receiver. That's like modern psychology 800 years ago. And we didn't appreciate that for a long time. That you've got to critique the receiver. Your receiver station, if you're angry, you're not receiving very well. If you're filled with agenda, you're not receiving very well because you've got your conclusion before the information. I had my conclusion in the first grade. In fact, I had 586 conclusions, right? In the first grade. I didn't need to go on a spiritual journey, and I'm grateful for this. It was a good container to get you started. But beyond that, it didn't know how to lead you into wisdom and into prayer and into that deep understanding. The third area, as I mentioned before, we've come to the recognition that many of the things we are concerned about, that we call the non-negotiables, are at major variance with what Jesus clearly emphasized. And I'm going to list them. How can you read the 8 Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount and not believe Jesus was teaching nonviolence? It's impossible. It's impossible. But so what we do, we just didn't read it, right? Now what happened, of course, and you've heard me say this before, some of you, the turning point is the year 313, the Edict of Constantine, where overnight we become the imperial religion, right? And we are used to create social order in Europe. We are the belonging system for Europe. Once you are the army, instead of being persecuted in the catacombs, everything Jesus says about nonviolence is unhearable. It's unthinkable. It's impossible. It can't even be allowed. So we would keep reading the teachings of Jesus, but there was a lens that disallowed us actually hearing what he was saying. His teaching on peacemaking was not possible. When I read in some of these election brochures last week that the non-negotiables were to be pro-life as defined recently, against stem cell research as defined recently, to be against contraception, I said, where did we create these new non-negotiables? Wouldn't you think, and I'm not standing on my opinion here, but the clear teaching of Jesus, wouldn't you think the clear non-negotiable in Jesus is forgiveness and love of enemies? That's the non-negotiable in the teaching of Jesus. Love your enemy. And I'm saying this to you clearly. You've got to do it. But we didn't teach that. It wasn't considered central teaching of Jesus at all. It's right at the heart of the matter. That could have changed history, right? But we weren't interested in changing this world. Remember, as Brian McLaren says, we got involved in an evacuation plan for the next world. So in fact, we've been largely the warmongers ourselves. None of the Christian nations have a record of peacemaking. None of them. None of them. Right? It wasn't even on the radar screen. And yet they dared to call themselves Christians. We have to go to our Mennonite and Amish and Quaker brothers and sisters who, thank God, retained the peace witness of the church. Justice and generosity toward the poor and the outsider. That's quite clear, quite absolute. Page after page after page of the Gospels. And now Christians think nothing of amassing massive fortunes, right? Living grandly. And this has been true of the papacy, been true of bishops, been true of priests. You can see why in religious life we said, at least you take a vow of poverty. Now we became pretty comfortable ourselves, as you know, because even Jesus' bias toward the poor was something that rich nations did not want to hear. Our Jesus' care for the poor is something that just didn't fit in our radar screen. His consistent message of inclusivity. You find a story where Jesus excludes, right? He will name the moment correctly, but he never excludes people. And yet, I think most people's estimation of most Christian denominations is they are largely exclusionary institutions. You don't fit, you don't fit. It's the life-saving station that has become a country club with its own membership rules. And even the Eucharist itself is used, at least in my Catholic church, to define the worthy, the pure, the true members. When every time Jesus eats, he seems to be eating with the wrong people at the wrong table, or saying the wrong things, or not washing his hands ahead of time. In fact, one scholar says, he says that you could say Jesus was crucified because of who he ate with. Jesus was crucified because who he ate with. That he redid the social order, and this upset both church and state. We don't like this new arrangement. We don't like who you're eating with. And that we would forget such a message and make the Eucharist itself some kind of measuring of worthiness is pretty much turning Jesus' teaching absolutely on its head. And I don't mean to be arrogant, but if I ever had the occasion to stand in front of the Pope himself, I would love to argue that, although that would get me argumentative. And that would not be good. But he knows there's no case for it in the Scriptures. And I said, did Jesus change all of his policies after he died? That before he died, he ate with outsiders and sinners. But after he died, he says, no, I think that was not a good idea. I don't think so. All right? There has to be a consistency between the pre-resurrected Jesus and the post-resurrected Jesus. So Jesus was concerned for social critique, social justice. He was concerned for the healing of human shame and human guilt. He's always taking away people's shame, always taking away their low self-esteem. And now many would say, and maybe it's a bit unfair, but many would say that we have ended up the chief purveyors of guilt and shame for people instead of the healing of it or the transforming of it into life and light. As you listen to the examples and the metaphors of Jesus, they're much more nature-based, lifestyle-based, relationship-based, much more than church-based or religion-based. He's simply, look at the lilies of the field. He's using normal examples that everybody can understand, not highfalutin theology, not highfalutin philosophy. Just look at things as they are and see what's real and see what's unreal. He clearly has a constant concern for issues of power, money, religious righteousness, than any attempt to create an in-group that is distinguishing itself from any kind of out-group. Or as I said before, I see Jesus as a reformer of all religions, much more than a single founder of a new religion, which now has to compete with all the other religions of the world. That changes everything. Once we got into the competitive mode, we had to prove we were right, and Buddhism and Hinduism and Judaism are all wrong. We got into the scapegoat mechanism that we have to this day. Finally, new structures that can make all of this possible. And let me say again, these new structures cannot be, we don't have time for it. They can't be in opposition to any existing church structures. The best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. Just go ahead and do it better. Right? Don't waste the next 20 years of your life being against anybody, anything, any group, any institution. Just go ahead and do it better. Isn't that fun? It's so common sense once you hear it. And yet, for some reason, people can't hear that. You see, the ego forms itself by being against things. It gives you an immediate sense of superiority, control, and identity. We call it identity politics. Just prove that that group is inferior to me, and for some reason, it holds my group together. It works. It works. And we saw it work with a certain percentage of people in this election. I think one reason we're rejoicing is that it didn't work with so many people. And that tells me we are growing up. Right? That tells me we are maturing. That we can't make an immediate appeal to identity politics anymore and have everybody jump on board as they did in most of history. All you had to do is wave the Polish flag, no offense to the Polish, and all the Polacks would be behind it. Do you understand? That's the way we all thought. I'm not picking on the Polish people. Every group that we are a part of thought the same way. That isn't going to work anymore. And I'd like to say that there's a direct line from the teaching of Jesus to that new consciousness, because he had no interest in it whatsoever, in creating belonging systems, which is what we've had up to now. Belonging systems instead of transformational systems. So these new structures, they have to be almost parallel and symbiotic to the existing church and structures. Now, these are already happening. Let me just mention a few of these mediating institutions. I bet most of you here and listening belong to these kind of groups, one or the other. Prayer groups, Bible study groups, service groups, soup kitchen service, third world justice groups, contemplative practice groups, centering prayer groups, just faith groups, the new monasticism. This is quite amazing. And yet most of these people have not left their historic tradition. You understand? They're finding a symbiotic relationship between the two. The other exciting piece of this is that really, again for the first time, we've stopped idealizing the top. When the world is shaped like a pyramid, for what you do is you, for some reason, worship those up at the top of the pyramid, because that holds your belonging system together. It works. Do you see? Now, what's happening is a recognition of real gifts, real ministries. The first question is not, is he ordained? Is he ordained? Has she studied theology? The question is, can she do the job? Is she changing lives? Is it working? We all listen to Dr. Phil in this country. And people will make their arguments on his show, and after the end of 20 minutes of argument, he'll just look at him and he'll say, and is this working for you? And invariably they'll have to say, well, no. And they say, then why do you keep doing something that isn't working? And so there's this whole emergence of lay leadership, that competence is what's important. Not this automatic superiority because 30 years ago a bishop laid hands on you. And I'm ordained too. I'm not against ordination. Please do not take offense if you're ordained. It's lovely. But we have to say, is it doing the job, right? Look at Europe. Europe is the one continent, no offense to Europeans, right? But Christianity had Europe in the bag. That's where we were in charge and in control for 2,000 years. And it's perhaps one of the most greedy, militaristic, next to us perhaps, parts of the world. There has been no triumph of the gospel, no triumph of an alternative set of values, but the concern is for materialism, nice clothes, nice houses, nice everything, just like we Americans. The gospel has not given us new structures that really call forth a different consciousness, because the church structures themselves were palaces, were basilicas, were signs of having made it into the establishment, not an alternative consciousness. So let me sum it up in this way. It seems to me that the emerging church is emerging because people, like no time in history, are finding the ability to have a grateful foot in both camps. The tradition, the mother church, what has mothered me and led me up to now, along with a new consensus, a new support group that parallels, deepens, broadens, grounds, and personalizes this traditional message. But you don't throw out the traditional message. This one becomes an accountability system for this one. And we realized we didn't have any accountability systems. So people just believed things that were usually highly academic, highly doctrinaire and dogmatic, sometimes a few strong moral positions to prove they were moral people, but you didn't really sense a transformed consciousness. So this tells me that the Holy Spirit is at work, because this is a new kind of thinking that, frankly, we just didn't have in history up to now. And it's telling us that we can't just keep building another life-saving station along the coast, right? Because in 20 years, it's going to need reform just as much as the Roman Catholic Church needed reform. And so we're saying there's got to be a new kind of reformation. We don't react. We don't rebel. We don't hate anything. You can't start a spiritual reformation by hating things. You're off on the wrong foot.